All right. If there's nothing else, we'll get started on the 6 items on today's agenda. First, we're happy to have Graham here, who will be giving us a summary of a paper that most of us are probably familiar with from the various iterations it's gone through. Uh, Congratulations and my commendations to you for your effort all this time. Going through all sorts of obstacles and barriers, and I know you still have a couple more to go through on a basically it's called a realistic climate strategy. That's the first thing. Robert Tulip has requested that he give a debrief on his conversations with Sev Clark, and given Sev's prolific activities in this sphere, I suspect that will be quite interesting. Um, I will be talking a bit about the planetary solvency report that we were supposed to talk about at an earlier town hall, but we ran out of time. Mike will be talking about the report issued by the UN Summit on the Future. Then I'll talk a little bit about a webinar I attended a few days ago, talking about the proliferation of moratoria on cooling testing, on geoengineering, now reaching 32 states in the U.S., or at least bills have been introduced, and as well as some information about Europe as well. And then Michael will wrap up, and coincidentally, but it's sort of putting a nice bow around it. He'll be talking about a climate realism discussion at the Council of Foreign Relations that you attended, Mike. So we're going to start with realism, and we're going to end with realism, and then we're going to look at planetary solvency in the UN. So I think, one way to look at today's program is we're going to get 4 or 5 different perspectives on what is climate realism, and probably 4 or 5 very different perspectives. So I think it should be, even though that wasn't the intent in putting this together, I think it's come across quite nicely, at least in theory. My thanks to Mike for helping me put this together today. So without further ado, Graham, the floor is yours. You got roughly about 12, 15 minutes or so.
Okay, let me just summarize what we've been doing. So for the last, I don't know, 3 years or something, been trying to get this article published, talking about the need for a climate triad strategy. And it originally started off as a combination. It was originally called The Bad Science and Good Intentions Blocking Climate Action, and which is probably a mistake because we put together the critique, the rationale for why the IPCC policies are, or why their policies haven't been working, and why the international climate strategies are failing. And we put that together along with the rationale for why we need a new 3-part climate strategy. But in any case, it's come out in many different versions. It's been submitted to 5 different journals. And we keep getting the runaround from it goes to reviewers, it goes from editors, they ask for changes, they delay in their responses. And in the end, they come up with some bureaucratic reason, such as they're no longer publishing opinion pieces or whatever, for why they can't print it, without ever clearly explaining why it doesn't qualify as a scientific article, as why the arguments are wrong, why it's not an important piece, or anything else. And so in response to this, we've decided to cut the article into 2 pieces. We've now got 2 articles. One of them is the one dealing with why current strategies are failing and can't avoid catastrophic climate change. And the second article will deal with the problems with methodology with the IPCC and why new approaches are needed for their assessments. So right now, the first stage is we're focusing on is getting out the article on the need for a realistic climate strategy. And it starts off by pointing out why the international climate strategies, the current ones, which are just reducing emissions and removing greenhouse gases, why that hasn't worked and can't work. And then it goes on to, argue for why we need a cooling interventions based on a risk assessment, and why the arguments put up by opponents, first of all, why they don't really deal with the real risks, the most dangerous hazards, which are mass extinctions and runaway climate change and civilizational collapse. And then our argument also is that whether you like it or not, geoengineering is coming, and it will be introduced as the costs of climate change become more and more obvious and more expensive. However, unless we start testing right now and we put governance in place, we will just have unilateral actions by different great powers. And rather than having the safest programs put in place, and rather than it be done in a way that has a climate triad, which also reduces the emissions and lowers the greenhouse gas concentrations that are going to acidify the oceans. Unless that happens, we will wind up with exactly what the environmental movement doesn't want, which is we will have continuation of burning fossil fuels and unilateral interventions without any kind of safeguards. And because of this, we need the paper calls for opponents of geoengineering, if they haven't got an alternative plan, which they don't, then to support the paper. So this is an attempt to put out a paper that will provide a fairly strong resource for proponents of cooling interventions, and a paper that we can then distribute, that HPAC and other allied groups can distribute very widely to journalists, to policymakers, to scientists, and environmental organizations. So I'm not going to. It's available. I'll post a link to it on the way for anybody who hasn't seen the paper. I'll post a link to it on here. But what I would like to do is because we've had so many problems with editors and environmentalists, editors and reviewers. I'm going to. I would like to this time send, when we make the submission in a few days, I would like to be able to also send along a list of maybe 3 or 4 potential reviewers who are likely to not just be ideologically opposed to geoengineering. So if there are some senior scientists here who are willing to have their names put forward, I would really appreciate it. And I've also got a couple of, a few others. Brian von Hertzen has generously offered, as well as Alan Kirsten. So, but if I get a couple of others, it would be very, very helpful. And I don't know if the editors of climatic change will pay any attention to this, but should they be looking for reviewers, and if they're willing to use one of these names, hopefully then we would actually get we would have a chance of getting this paper through and getting it published. So anyway, if anybody's willing to, I'd appreciate it if they would put up their names or send me their name after the call.
If you're making the paper available, I'd be interested in reading it and making comments, not as an official reviewer, but is that okay?
Sure. Sorry, who is that?
This is Greg Slater.
Oh, Greg. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Yeah,
All
yeah,
right.
of course. I'll send one. Well, I'll post the link right now, but I'll also send it to you.
Thank you.
That's a good question. Are you I guess when you put a preprint up and I took a look at it, there is room to comment at the site on the paper, and presumably those comments will be reviewed by you and your co-authors for whatever final version hopefully gets after peer review gets published. Is that the way it works?
Well, that's the way it's supposed to work. In reality, we're not leaving much time for that. So, hoping to submit this in the next couple of days, quite very, very briefly. So, if there were some very, I mean, obviously, if you find some real errors in it, some glaring errors with inappropriate references or factual things that are factually wrong, then of course we would like to jump on it and stop it before it goes any further. But otherwise, I'm afraid we don't have time to get back to all seven co-authors and go back and forth and write and rewrite the paper. That paper's been rewritten 20 times. So at this point, I think we're pretty well. We're in a rush to try to, make some kind of intervention that's going to have an impact. I don't think we can let this drag on for a couple more years. More than that, I don't have I'm getting old. I don't have the time to spend the next 2 or 3 years keep working on the same damn paper. I've got other things I'd like to do.
Fair enough. Thanks for that clarification. I think we all shared that last sentence with you that you said.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions for Graham? If not, I have a question. I think I raised this at the NOAC meeting also, and that is, do you and your co-authors have any plans for how you can promote and publicize and get the word out? We all know putting a paper out doesn't mean anything unless people read it, and or at least even if they don't read it, if they get the gist of it, the people that count. So, do you have any thoughts on that? Certainly, we're HPAC. The A is for action. So, and whether it's today or in the future, let us know how we can help you promote the paper, which from my reading of it, and I think my colleagues would agree, is largely, if not completely, consistent with our policies and so forth.
Well, I think that's a next stage. Of course, Dennis is a co-author, and uh, I think I think it's really critical to once the paper is published to to send out individual individually write thousands of key journalists, scientists, policymakers, and environmental leaders and so on like that to send it out to get support for it. For example, later today, I have a Zoom meeting with Clive and Claude to talk about video. Again, to talk about the story and the message and what are the elements for that. So it's really, I think, important for us to fundraise to make some 1 minute, 3 minute, 10-minute videos. I think Dennis, of course, is I think really keen on. He's probably got some comments on this, but on how we publicize it. I think it's really important for us to. One of the key areas we have to work on is ending the opposition of groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and Greta Thunberg and so on like this. These key environmental leaders, because it's their opposition that's turning off the young people in particular and blocking a lot of support. So right now, opposition to cooling interventions is coming from two areas. It's coming from the fossil fuel industry, which sees it as climate alarmism. They don't want to have to admit that there's a crisis. And on the other hand, it's coming from progressive movements who see it as interfering with Mother Nature, right? And so I think the first thing we have to do is align progressives around it, because I am absolutely sure that you're going to see China, the United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, other groups, anybody who's got rockets is going and planes is going to be every major power that's facing environmental catastrophes or the loss of major crop failures, more mass climate
Sure.
disasters. They're going to start when they see one coming or in the face of it, they're going to start making unilateral interventions. And so,
Well, if you want to engage progressives, best way to do it is to point out that it's the MAGA cohort that is going to do all of these geoengineering bans and try and get present geoengineering as being a rational line of inquiry backed up by reputable institutions and esteemed scientists, and give them a stick to beat MAGA with. I mean, everything's just partisan, tribal one-upmanship in the end. So you can just leverage their mutual hatred to your advantage.
well,
let me just finish. We're running a little after.
Okay.
We've got 5 other items, but let
Sorry.
me just say that that's all right, to Andrew and everybody, we have on later on the agenda a discussion on the moratoria that's going on. So we can address your comment, Andrew, at that time. Very quickly, I see Robert and Ron have their hands up. Just make it quick.
Graham's partly addressed my point, but just to add to that question of why is there such strong opposition, Dan Miller's recent conversation with Leon Simmens explored this to some extent, and I just felt that neither Dan nor Leon were framing the need for intervention in a very clear or coherent way, and so that's really the objective of Graham's paper. And so Leon commented that the opposition within the climate action movement to geoengineering interventions is increasing, which I just find really surprising.
Thanks, Robert. Ron?
Yes, thank you. Just a quick comment that we may take up later. There in the HPAC cooling paper, we advocate a kind of evolutionary approach to governance. So we're in contrast to most of the other folks supporting SAI, we are not saying that we need the kind of ideal governance structure before we start to gradually pilot this and try it out. So I'm just, perhaps you can clarify that, Graham, because I know I made a comment on this in earlier versions of the paper, like the relationship to governance, but we don't want to get into a situation where we're on the one hand sort of saying, oh, this would be a terrible thing if a bunch of countries, quote unquote, unilaterally decided to do SAI, because in fact, we're kind of saying that some kind of coalition of the willing like that may be the best, the most realistic option.
Okay, Ron, we're running out of time.
We're advocating transparency and public, and to generate confidence so that the world can eventually support global SAI. So that's just, I just think we want to make sure that we're all more or less on the same page on this, and so if
briefly,
maybe
Ron, please
later on we can take that up. Yeah.
If you want, Clive, why don't you go, and then briefly, if Graham wants to respond to either Ron or Clive, very quickly.
Yeah, just very briefly. Dan Miller released a video today where he was summarizing Jim Hanson's most recent newsletter kind of paper, which is again saying climate sensitivity is 4.5, and there's going to, so, but bottom line, he's saying that he's going to talk to Jim Hanson soon, and his next video is going to be talking about the impact on policy options. So we should all look out for that, maybe especially you, Graham.
Okay, any quick response, Graham?
Okay, quickly, in the paper, tried not to get into too much discussion about precisely about governance or about the types of technologies or anything else like that. We're trying to keep it focused on the fact that the existing climate strategy has failed and we need cooling interventions. And I think that a lot of the opposition from environmental groups and so on to cooling interventions has to do with this idea of moral hazard, that once you do this, you take pressure off of the need for reducing emissions. So everybody's been focused on keeping things, ramping up existing strategies to keep the temperatures under 1.5 to 2 degrees. The point is that now that's clearly failed. And what we're arguing in the paper, again, we're pointing out we've lost 2 degrees. We're heading, we've already got dangerous climate change. We're heading towards catastrophic climate change. We're heading towards 3 degrees plus. And so
Okay,
I think the point being here that I think that we're going to start seeing a lot of people of environmental, scientists, environmental groups who are going to be much more open to new arguments, because they will realize the reality that the 2 degree target is dead.
Okay, thank you. Ken, our deepest appreciation to you, Graham, and your co-authors. And the last thing I'll say very briefly is what I said at the NOAC meeting, and that is that I'm willing, happy to work with you to see if we can get you on the channel that I'm involved in as host, the Climate Emergency Forum. We averaged 5,000 viewers. And our last program a few weeks ago, we had Peter Wadhams, one of your co-authors. We got 32,000. So if you bring Peter back on, that's a pretty impressive number of people or so. So let's stay in touch on that one. Okay, you've got 10 minutes, Robert. Tulip.
So I spent 4 days at Sev's beautiful house in Mount Macedon, just north of Melbourne, over the last weekend, and it was just great. I'm sorry Sev's not with us at this meeting, but it was just a great opportunity to explore his proposals in a bit more depth. And there are half a dozen proposals that he's developed as inventions to cool the planet. And I'd just like to mention again several of them, and they are marine nanobubbles and buoyant flakes and Arctic ice shields and a method for salt aerosol generation. And
I think Russell Seitz invented the nanobubbles one about 15 years ago.
Well, if you, there's no need to interrupt, Andrew. I was going to say that what Sev's approach has been is to examine existing proposals and look at ways that can improve them and make them more effective and so on. So with the nanobubbles. The work that Seitz did was on micro bubbles rather than at the nanoscale, and the significant advantage suggested of working at the nanoscale is primarily in the durability. And I'll put a link in the chat to a very interesting short Japanese video of a method that's been developed to produce nanobubbles of air in water. It's been used to improve oxygenation of water to improve water quality and destroy waste. And so Sev's concept is that by using this carbon ceramic material and forcing water into a carbon ceramic disc and spinning the disc, that when the bubbles come out at the perimeter of the disc and the disc is spinning, the faster the spin, the smaller the bubbles, and then in an ocean environment that has phytoplankton, the nanobubbles will form a surfactant coating which will improve their durability. And so I find it really interesting because it appears to be a technology that has a higher technology readiness level than marine cloud brightening in terms of cost, and also acceptability, because it's not adding anything to the air. It's really just an imperceptible brightening of the ocean water. I had a good discussion with Brian and a couple of others yesterday about this, and there are issues about whether it would damage coral reefs, but that's the sort of thing you would really think that the tourism industry for example, on the Great Barrier Reef, would be interested to just test it out and see if it's something that will help to slow local coral bleaching. So that's marine nanobubbles. With Sev's buoyant flakes concept, the really interesting thing about that is the use of waste materials such as rice husks and red mud mine tailing waste to improve the cost and the effectiveness of ocean iron fertilization and other ocean nutrient fertilization. And the advantage is with rice husks that they float, and there's a lot of them available as waste, which could be utilized. Coating the rice husks with whatever combination of nutrients such as iron or nitrates or other things that are needed to create algal blooms. The really interesting thing to me here is that it reminds me very much of the Green Revolution in agriculture in the 1960s with Norman Borlaug, that the great work that was done to add fertilizer to cereal crops has been the great prevention of starvation in our world, and yet we haven't taken that forward to say the same thing is needed to be done in the ocean to fertilize the oceans and improve fisheries yields. So a very interesting concept. On Arctic ice shields, Seb's been in quite a bit of discussion with Sean Fitzgerald at Cambridge about his different ideas, and Seb's argument is that when you pump ocean water up onto sea ice, that you need to do so in a pulsing way, so that you pump a little bit up and it forms a frozen layer quite quickly, and you wait for it to freeze, and then you pump another layer on top rather than just a continuous flood, and that will create a disk, and forming an interlocking array of disks will be like a honeycomb, and it would be possible to generate a stable array of circles that are powered by one wind turbine for every dozen or more circles. And so it should be possible to use this method to enhance things like prevention of slowing down glacier flow, and also even creating a transpolar canal. So I think that's one that's really worth looking at. And finally, the salt aerosol generators. Sev's argument is that the micron-sized nozzle proposed by Stephen Salter is too energy intensive, and that combining a larger nozzle with a mesh and just spraying air orthogonally at right angles to the spray will form a nano size submicron aerosol stream, and that then adding baffles to the flowing stream will remove the larger aerosol particles, just leaving the smaller ones that are needed. So we also discussed a couple of other things like drilling a hole in the ground. Okay, thanks, Herb. Drilling a hole in the ground a couple of kilometres deep that's a metre wide, and piping biomass down into it is a very interesting way to use hydrothermal liquefaction to convert biomass into a combination of hydrocarbons and an aqueous stream. And also the whole idea of constituencies for sunlight reflection, and the idea that the insurance industry needs to be targeted as a primary constituency to get things underway. So I'll leave it at that, just to say that I really appreciated being able to catch up with Sev, and that he's been working on these things for a long time, and as we know, with all of these technologies, they just get ignored largely, and so I just wanted to share that as something that I found quite inspiring and useful. Thank you.
Robert, that was a remarkable download in 10 minutes. I am terribly impressed, and I think the rest of us are. And it obviously could generate lots of conversation, and perhaps you and or Seb might want to bring some of these things up either for the first time or again with Clive and a NOAC meeting where they're more technically oriented. But thanks again for that. Let me move to the third item, which is planetary solvency. I think most of you have heard of this report. Mike and I were supposed to discuss this at our last town hall where we had Sumitra, and it was such a rich conversation with Sumitra that I decided to not push him off the stage and let him continue till the end of the program. George, I would just want to take a few minutes on that, and I'm going to introduce Mike to follow up on that and talk about the UN report. And if you want more information on planetary solvency, I hosted a video on our channel, the CEF channel, a couple months ago. I can put a link to that or send it around. Basically, I think the first notable thing to comment on, from my perspective, is that this was a report between the cross-disciplinary lines, which is so essential. And I think many of you would agree with me that's one of the biggest challenges and one of the major reasons why we make so little progress on most anything, because of our siloed nature. And this was done in a partnership. This was the third report in a series of reports between, I don't have the exact name, something like the Institute of Actuaries for that's in the UK, but they have offices in the Far East and so forth. So I suspect they're a largely international organization. And the folks at Exeter, the Tipping Points folks, Tim Lenton and so forth. So again, this was their third report. And the second, the substance of it is not going to surprise any of you. It's the stuff we've been talking about here. It's the stuff we talk about in the vision paper, in the urgent cooling paper and so forth. It's how bad things are, how the, and what Graham, it talks about in your paper there. It's all the same, essentially different ways of packaging the same message, which is that we're not evaluating risk properly. We're underestimating it for lots of ideological, political, and economic reasons. And, and that's got to change. The first person that who wrote about this that I found very inspiring, and he's sort of a climate hero of mine, is David Spratt of Australia, who I brought into us a couple of years ago to speak. But again, unfortunately, he and his institute weren't listened to very much, except by some of us. And today we're a decade later, and hopefully it'll be listened to, but of course it may well be too late. I mean, the other point I wanted to make about it, or another point, is the fact that, I mean, there is a fair amount of careful, nuanced language, but there's also some language that really just hits home and cuts through the BS and the academic jargon. So in the report at one point, when they were talking to one of the economic models that projected, I think, a 15% loss of GDP by the end of the century, this is a rough quote. Their comment on that report was, "This is analogous to carrying out a risk assessment of the impact of the Titanic hitting an iceberg while excluding the possibility that the ship could sink, that there would be a shortage of lifeboats, and that death from drowning or hypothermia could occur. So that's hardly scientific language, but I mean, I think most of us would agree that that's not an unfair assessment of, of the state of so much climate discourse. And part of the reason, certainly not the only reason, we're in the mess we are. They put together a kind of matrix. They did a very detailed slide presentation that Mike sent me the other day that has about 1,000 words on some of the slides. But we're happy to put that in the chat and send it around to you. But basically, they sort of came up with 5 categories, and we're dealing with language, of course, and the inadequacy of language. But in terms of rating the degree of extremity, they go from limited to severe to decimation to catastrophic and to extreme. That's the 5 they choose, with extreme being the most quote unquote extreme. And then basically that's sort of one part of the matrix. And then the other part is they have 4 or 5 categories where they're basically looking at societal, how society is functioning. They're looking at nature and the collapse of nature or not, climate, and the economy, and the impact on human mortality. So it's really interesting how they put it together. Again, it's judgment. Others may disagree with it, but it's sobering, and it reflects a degree of realism that I think is very commendable. And they do certainly put the possibility, there's certainly not the inevitability, and then they look at where we are today and their projection, at least, or assessment of where we're likely to be in 2050 without, extreme or at least substantial mitigation. And they say it's certainly possible, and I think this is what made some of the headlines, that there will be a reduction in GDP of over 50%, which could lead to more than 4 billion deaths, and equally sobering statistics that I don't think you'll find in any IPCC report. So I highly recommend the report. But to me, the real question, and I believe for us, is okay, how do we take advantage of information that maybe is presented in a novel way or in certainly a compelling way, and use it to advance our mission and our goals. And what strikes me is, and I find it very both not surprising and very depressing, is that you look at the distribution. That's why I asked you, Graham, about distribution, promotion. You have this incredibly important report issued by 2 very prestigious entities, and yet when I looked on YouTube, I'm not happy to have to say this, that the Climate Emergency Forum that I host their programs, and one of our 2 regular panelists, Paul Beckwith, on his programs accounted for more than half of the viewings or viewership of this report. I mean, this report is too important, to be promoted almost exclusively or largely by Herb Simmons and Paul Beckwith. And Exeter themselves, when they put it out on YouTube, we had 5,000 viewers for ours. We did it 2 months ago. Exeter put it out themselves, a major university with a huge PR department. They had less than 3,000 views. Another group had on Sandy Trust, who is the key author from the Actuary Institute. They had 5,000. Dan Miller had devoted a whole program to it. I didn't watch most of it, but he had fewer than 3,000 viewers. And the Actuary Institute themselves put it out a year ago, something before the report, but they called it Climate Solvency, and they had, unbelievably, they had 57 viewers. So, and also if you look at the mainstream media, I forgot to check before today, but when I checked a few weeks ago, none of the mainstream media picked this up. So it's one more. It's if you clap your hands in the forest and no one is there, does anybody hear it? And so we can praise the report, we can critique the report, we can do whatever the hell we want. But the bottom line is that it's now obviously the flip side is maybe there are private discussions going on. Maybe a few actuaries or others have read this and talking to their colleagues in government, and something will happen that we don't know of. But we certainly can't count on that. So that's really sort of what I wanted to emphasize, is that, you know, we need to focus not just on what's written, and as important as that is, obviously that's the prerequisite to get the facts right and to have a compelling message that's scientifically defensible. But if nobody's going to listen, or we don't know how we collectively, I don't mean HPAC per se, don't know how to promote it, then, you know, what difference does it make? So let me stop there. I see both Robert and Greg. Greg, do you still have your hand up? Well, let me go to Robert Tulip first.
So in our discussions, both with Sev and also with John MacDonald, John has a good friend who's a senior insurance executive, but is just not interested at all in climate change. But the Insurance Council of Australia is a body that's I'm seeking to through John's colleague to write to draw attention to this report, and to essentially make a summary argument as to why the insurance industry should lobby for research into sunlight reflection. And so I see that as really potentially a primary constituency, given the scale of losses that they face and the market failure in mortgage insurance that's looming in so many markets.
Yeah, well, obviously the fact that it's co-sponsored by the actuarial group, a prestigious international actuarial group, but one of the most conservative groups around, you know, should help you in opening those doors. Greg.
I also think, Herb, that there's an important point is to say that, and this gets to the HPAC triad, that if action on sunlight reflection is linked to essential action on emissions, then I think that that's a turnoff for a body like the Insurance Council. Like if they were able to say, we can do work on reducing our climate risk without getting into the political debate about emissions, then I think that that's likely to be more attractive for them. And so, like if people wanted to make similar pushes to the Institute of Insurers in the US and so on, and in other countries, that's the path that I'm taking.
Okay, thanks. By the way, I didn't mention, speaking of SRM, the report does acknowledge the need for more research in SRM, which, as far as I know, is the first time any report that has had Tim Lenton's name on it has been positive about SRM. So I think that's a huge potential huge advance. I'd forgotten to mention that, but we'll see what he says at his Tipping Points conference in July. And then we have very briefly, because I don't want to take away from Mike, we have Greg and Clive and Ron. I think you put your hand down. Greg and Clive.
Okay. The only thing I was going to say is that you were talking about the difficulty of getting conversations in front of the public rather than just the academic community, whatever's. I am curious why the relatively few number of well-known and respected academics who are interested in at least broaching this concept of cooling, like what's his name? I'm geezing right now. Anyway, they seem unwilling to mix with the hoi polloi. That's us. In other words, they want to stay in their ivory tower, even though they are in a way outcasts themselves, but it's harder than hell to get these guys to actually appear on YouTube's other than ones or on media that are not, highly prestigious channels.
No, your point's well taken. That's like a lot of these comments, they could be worth a whole hour and a half discussion on that, Greg.
Okay, go ahead.
Point well taken. Clive.
Yeah. I just put a link in the chat. The PBS Terror is a channel on YouTube that has 600 and something or other 1,000 subscribers, and the last video 340,000 views, talking about a cold patch in the Pacific Ocean. So they might be, and I've seen one or two of the videos, very well, good production quality, a much younger, nice looking young lady presents, but properly, it's done very professionally. So I think try them.
Okay.
PBS
And by the way,
Terror.
yeah, I mean, thanks for that. I will certainly look them up. Dave, I forgot his last name, from Just Have a Think, did a program on one of the previous reports by the Actuaries Institute that got 250,000, I believe, or even more viewers. I mean, I don't know if any of you watch him regularly. He's really engaging and very graphically interesting, and he's found the kind of the ingredients for getting being likable and presenting this stuff, and it's just quite a skill. It's not easy to do. All right, let me wrap it up. Thank you so much for that. And let me just, before I forget, and then I'll introduce Mike. Just want to state again, we sent a note out on this that Mike and I and Sumitra have organized a panel discussion on nature-inspired climate intervention at the DC Climate Week on the 29th of April in person. So those of you who are going to be in DC or can make it to DC or have friends or family in DC, please attend. We're now we had 50 people was our cap, but we oversubscribed. Now we've gotten it open to 65, and we've already gotten to 60 of 65, and we're actually trying to put together a second section to do it on another day as well. A lot of interest in this, so keep that in mind. And now I'm happy, as always, to introduce Mike, who's going to talk about the UN report. Thanks, Mike. Are you muted or? Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
no, I want to say one thing about the planetary solvency one, which is very interesting. But one thing that's intriguing is they really don't talk about having a different decision framework than the scientists do. And so they talk about this terrible thing, but they don't talk so much about why they're different and why when you're in insurance or actuaries, I mean, they're really watching out for how the risks that corporations are taking on, essentially, that you don't use the same decision framework as scientists do. You look for risks rather than look for what the consensus central view is, and they don't. It really isn't explicitly explained, and I think that's sort of an unfortunate aspect of it. And so it comes across as, oh, well, it's just sort of the same old approach. Well, no, they're actually different from the traditional scientists for a reason, because they're looking at the risks that corporations are taking, or banks are taking, or others are taking with climate change. So let me say just why Herb and I sort of put these 4 talks of ours together here. We've been trying to figure out how to head toward talks about governance and how things are going and how to approach the issue as a whole. So, this planetary solvency sort of comes at it by some people saying, oh, well, this is really terrible. We got lots of risk. What should we do? We should do more of what we've been doing. I mean, that's their sort of approach to it. I was going to talk about a little bit about what the UN did last September. Maybe some of you were in New York when it did it. But it's very interesting, the documents they put out and how really engaging and wanting to work the leaders of these various nations are. I mean, it's sort of a very different voice. They do comment how terrible it is that climate change is still going on and is impacting, slowing down or maybe even making impossible the Sustainable Development Goals, which they hold up as the most important thing to be working on, and stuff. So it's kind of intriguing what happens. So what they did was put together so at the climate summit, they had some activism the first 2 days, I guess, but then the summit with the leaders put together what's called a pact for the future. and it has some things, and I'll read some phrases out of it. And it has two appendices. One is a global digital compact, which I'm not going to get into, but it had a declaration on future generations. So it's looking ahead and talking about it. And that's sort of a very interesting thing. And then, so they did their thing, and then the General Assembly sort of endorsed it the next week. But the Pact for the Future, says some things where, gee, wouldn't climate intervention fit in? So action one, well, category one is sustainable development and financing for development. But action one is, we will take bold, ambitious, accelerated, just, and transformative actions to implement the 2030 agenda, which is sort of the Sustainable Development Goals, achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and leave no one behind. Well, that's kind of interesting. I mean, if we're going to approach them, one would go and say, well, you say you're going to take bold, ambitious action. Let us suggest what it is other than the same old, action. So they list 55 actions or something. Okay. But under sustainable development and financing for development, they have about 12 of them. 9 is, we will strengthen our actions to address climate change. That's nice, but it really doesn't say much. They do. The next one is, we will accelerate our efforts to restore, protect, conserve, and sustainably use the environment. And so here they're introducing the word restore for us. I mean, they want to do that. So it's almost sort of opening up a real possibility to try and frame it in what their mind is, their thinking is. They have a set of 6 actions in the area of science, technology, and innovation. The first one is, we will seize the opportunities presented by science, technology, and innovation for the benefit of people and the planet. We sort of think that's what we fit into, kind of interesting language. They have some actions down here on transforming governance. We will transform global governance and reinvigorate the multilateral system to tackle the challenges and seize the opportunities of today and tomorrow. I guess I'm just saying, if we're going to if one's going to put a proposal together, there's lots of good things to quote in here. We will strengthen the Economic and Social Council to accelerate sustainable development. Well, it's interesting because they recognize elsewhere how sustainable development is becoming very hard to achieve. If they really want to accelerate it and achieve it, they're going to have to almost certainly use climate intervention of some form. So there's just an awful lot of words in this document, where they say they're going to go forward and do things. Let's see, what were the other ones I was going to read? The promotion of responsible and ethical use of science, technology, and innovation, guided by the principles of equity and solidarity, is necessary to foster an open, fair, and inclusive environment for scientific and technological development and digital cooperation, while bridging the scientific, technological, and innovation divides. So they are talking about the kind of moral justice issue that we sort of talk about, that it isn't that we're going to fall back and use coal again, despite what our president seems to say. But the issue is what's going to happen to the most vulnerable people. And in this DC Climate Week, what Herb and I are talking about doing is the science. And then we have Sumitra is going to talk about what climate change is going to mean to the vulnerable people in the subtropical and tropical latitudes where India is situated, and how important that is. So, in wealthy countries, you can imagine, people do live in Texas in the summer, but they live by being inside in air-conditioned space. That's not something you can do to air condition India and Africa, in any reasonable time compared to what we're talking about with climate. So I'm just saying, I guess in developing whatever our thoughts are on the Bellum Declaration or something, there are all kinds of quotes in here. Prioritize prioritize urgent action to address critical environmental challenges as well as climate change and its adverse impacts. There are all sorts of things in here, and could it be that putting the Belling Declaration, which is trying to say, hey, you really need to be thinking about intervention, as something that is framed here, because one of the things these international organizations do is refer to what other people do and put forward. They endorse what the findings of this group or that group. And so picking up from the words that are in these documents, seems to me something that would be very valuable to do in preparing it. Leveraging science, data, statistics, and strategic foresight to ensure long-term thinking and planning. That's sort of what we want to do and everything. So I'm just sort of raising it. It's very interesting to read these things. They're very optimistic and aspirational and hopeful. But they apparently approved them. I've got to find out if the United States actually voted for them, because they're almost the exact opposite of what our president is thinking. Has all sorts of DEI kinds of things in there about equity and stewardship and diversity and promoting that, helping everything. So I just wanted to make sure we sort of think about it, because it just provides wonderful text to draw from on that.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And what a contrast between the Planetary Solvency Report, Graham's paper, and the rhetoric of the UN report. And I think that's an excellent idea. Let's use the quotes there. Let's use the consensus they developed to promote the agenda that we believe in. And go ahead, Mike.
And you're going to talk about moratoria, which is sort of happening. But the next thing I'll talk about is the climate realism issue, which is from the Council of Foreign Relations, and their view of how to proceed, which is actually quite different than what the UN leaders and all the nations were saying.
Well, we'll look forward to that after I spend maybe 10 minutes at most on the moratoria issue, which feeds right into this. And actually, I just got a comment back on LinkedIn that's relevant to this. So I attended a webinar hosted by SRM 360, as many of you know, is a new SRM, not an advocacy group, an information group. I think it's very important. There are almost no advocacy groups for SRM out there, except us, with our caveats, of course. But they're informational. Pete Irvine is one of their key people. I think most of you know Pete, or from the University College of London. I think he's back in Chicago with David Keith right now, and is a key person there. And basically, they were talking about two dimensions of it: the emphasis in a number of European reports that I have not read in detail. Maybe some of you have, on establishing moratoria consistent with or similar to the moratoria that was promoted by the Overshoot Commission. Essentially, almost a kind of contradictory, maybe not exactly contradictory, but a cognitively dissonant approach that we think there should be more research, but let's put a moratorium on actually doing any experimentation or deployment out there. And which, I want to hear your views on this. My own view is that's an extremely unhelpful approach. But then the second thing was this emerging the trend that's exploding in the U.S. of states introducing bills to outlaw, not moratoria, to outlaw geoengineering. There are various language. I certainly haven't attempted to read them. I don't think that would be good for my mental health. But I think the basic idea is that geoengineering is scary, that it's somehow connected with chemtrails and UN Black Hawk helicopters and all kinds of really wild ass conspiracy stuff. There's only one bill that I'm aware of that's actually law now, and that's in Tennessee. But there are efforts in 32 states now, so that actually covers some purple states and maybe even some Democratic states to introduce bills. So what struck me listening to the four academics speak at this webinar was that, nobody raised the question of, well, who's opposing this? Why is there an effort to testify to these legislators or meet with them privately and do the kind of lobbying that's done on every other bill? So I raised that question and I got a kind of, well, I don't think anybody is, which just really, you know, it just infuriated me. It just seemed like this academic, and they're good people. They want to see, knowledge advance on SRM, the folks who were on the panel. But the divorce from real life really struck me. And so coincidentally, two things just today that popped up relevant to this, as I saw on LinkedIn, Peter Irvine basically put a chart showing the growth in the number of states introducing these bills. And so I basically made a comment to him just a couple hours ago. Is anybody lobbying against this? Have you guys organizing anything? Blah, blah, blah. Am I right? And he responded, I see now, and a very brief response. He says, I am not aware of an organized pushback. There might be organizations that are looking at this, but it's a touchy subject, so they may be doing it discreetly. So, I mean, what are you going to say to that? Either he knows more than he's saying, or he's not even interested enough to try to find out about what's happening. But to me, that's very striking in terms, again, I focus on the politics of this stuff more than the technical. The second piece is also today or yesterday. Those of you who have what I believe is a fantasy that somehow Donald Trump is going to come and rescue us with geoengineering. Well, his EPA director, who's, Environmental Protection Agency, who is eagerly chopping apart and destroying every aspect of that really esteemed organization, he put out a tweet. I guess it's a post these days. And he says, guess what? I think you'll appreciate this one. This is not just from a staff person. This is from the head of the US EPA under Donald Trump. And it says, Make Sunsets is a startup that is geoengineering by injecting sulfur dioxide into the sky and then selling cooling credits. This company is polluting the air we breathe. I've instructed my team that we need to quickly get to the bottom of this and take immediate action. And then he highlights a letter that was sent by the Deputy Principal Assistant Administrator, classic bureaucratic title, Office of Air and Radiation. Of course, this at the same time that they're dismantling every actual program to protect our air and water. And so probably EPA in a year or so will wind up with a division of 7 people, 5 of whom are bringing lawsuits against Make Sunsets or something. But anyway, I think this is very instructive also. And the last thing I want to say, and then I'll open it up for comments on this. Some of you may have heard, those of you who have been willing to go down the rabbit hole of chemtrails and conspiracies and all that. The leading proponent of this sort of chemtrail stuff is this guy by the name of Dane Wigington. He's produced all kinds of videos and books and so forth. So he commented in response to the EPA director's intention to essentially shut down Make Sunsets on Twitter again, or on X, just a few hours ago. He says, is the head of the US EPA actually claiming to be legitimately investigating decades-long international covert climate engineering operations by targeting 2 Silicon Valley clowns that launched a balloon from a dilapidated motorhome in Baja California? Is this a joke or a pathetically transparent attempt to distract the public from the climate engineering Manhattan Project that continues to rage in on our skies and wreak havoc with weather all over the world? So there you have it, sort of like this little vignette into the, the fervid swamps of conspiracy in the United States from every angle. And all I can say is it makes our job all that much more difficult that, that no one apparently is pushing back against any of this unless they're doing it very, very quietly. And I'm not sure why one would do it quietly. So let me see if we take any comments or questions, and then I'll turn it back to Mike for the last proceeding. Graham.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that Trump administration, if anything is connected, if there's any group that is trying to work on a climate change issue, they're opposed to it. And they will again use it as a red herring to as part of their attack on the radical Marxists that have taken over America, right? Which I haven't noticed, by the way, but that's the theory. But in any case, I think from my perspective, it's pretty clear that I think the whole MAGA movement will self-destruct, and they will be a lot weaker in another couple of years, and you know, particularly in 4 years, I think that'll be the Republicans will have really committed some kind of ritual suicide. But so our priority has to be building an international movement. If there's going to be progressive initiatives taking place, it probably will not take place in the United States, but although at least not on a federal level. But I think that on the positive side, I really think that the reality is going to be biting, and there's going to be an increasing awareness of the fact that the existing climate strategies have failed, and there's going to be a growing awareness and a more willingness to engage among environmental organizations, policymakers, and scientists. So I think we have to just focus on building a coalition, and also focus on all the the rest of the world too. All the countries and organizations and governments and so on like that outside of the United States for now. But I think progressives will come back, or relative progressives will come back in the United States in 4 years. But not.
Well, I don't. Thanks. I don't share your optimism, but that's what will be will be. By the way, the latest, as I understand it, the latest. Let me just go back for a second. When I was doing research for my book, I found, and I'm sure most of you have noticed this, that the climate deniers over the past couple of decades switch their arguments, as often as the rest of us take a shower. I mean, it's just every other day when one argument looks shaky, then they go to another. It's not real, or it's real, but it's no big deal, or it is a big deal, but it's too late to do anything, or the scientists don't know, whatever. I'm not a scientist, so I can't answer the question. Well, apparently the latest emerging approach from the Trump administration may well be that, yes, it is real, and it's really good for us. Anyway, wait, let's see if we hear that from the president someday soon. That's what I've read between the lines from one of my DC sources. So let me go to Greg and then Aria.
Just on this point that there's 36 states formulating laws against prohibiting a variety of cooling techniques or whatever, SAI in particular. I mean, the question is, or the question for you, Herb, is when you say opposing them, I mean, I'm for advocating for immediate tests, and I'm not willing to anymore pull my punches or stay quiet about the need for immediate open air tests. I mean, are you of the opinion that is a bad strategy at this point because it scares these states, or what's if you were the one doing appearing before them and saying and presenting a counter argument, what would be your strategy?
Well, you put me on the spot, which I'm going to get myself off the spot by saying that for 25 years I worked in state and local government and often had to submit testimony and personally testify in front of legislatures, and I would never develop a strategy off the top of my head. So that's my way of sidestepping your question. But it's a very valid question, and I think, my simple answer, which may or may not satisfy you, is it would depend on the particulars of what the bill was. I do the background dossiers on the legislators. There are any number of approaches to use to push back against this, and that's what sophisticated lobbyists learn how to do. And of course, the first thing you learn how to do, and this is almost completely missing, I think, in the world in terms of support for SRM, other than maybe from silver lining to some degree in a couple other groups, is you build relationships with people who make decisions, so they trust you, so that when an issue or a piece of legislation comes up, and you give them your opinion, it's not an opinion from some guy or lady that just flew in from out of state or out of the country. So anyway, that's a long answer to your short question.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I would say that I'm at this point more in the abolitionist camp from, the 1800s, who are like just through with making compromises. And of course they were hated by a lot of people, and they were everything, but they push things along.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we certainly need people on that flank. It's like Rupert Reed in the UK, and the sort of the majority climate flank that he's developed versus Roger Hallam on the other end. Aria.
Yeah, I've just been thinking about political action committees, and we are HPAC. And what would it take to actually become a PAC and, really focus and be able to target toward going in and advocating to government and legislators and, getting funding behind it, because this is the thing that has slowed us way, 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 way down is getting the funding. So I'm just wondering how, is there something in that where if we decide to create a PAC, would that be able to amplify our impact and ability to get funds for the cause? Is there something in that for us?
Good question. Unfortunately, like a lot of other good questions and comments, we don't have time to address it now, but don't, keep that idea alive and certainly bring it up again, and maybe it can be, something considered by the appropriate entity at HPAC. Appreciate that, Aria. Certainly, as I said, the fact is that nobody, apparently, the people who were most involved in SRM, like the Peter Irvines and others, don't appear to even have the slightest idea if anybody is opposed to it. None of the newspaper articles I read indicated anyone has testified or lobbied against it. Tells you a whole lot about the state of advocacy in the U.S. at least. And with that, I want to make sure that Mike has. Well, no. I got Mike for 10 minutes. I don't want to take your time away, Mike. Thanks.
Okay,
Aria. Yeah. Go ahead, Mike. You wrap up.
Okay. All right. Well, first, let me say that I'll be speaking against it. I'm going to be interviewed by Nick Breeze about the interview he did with Ray Pierre Humbert. So I get to make the case in that interview, and I guess it'll be released at some point in the future or something like that. In the exchanges with him, one of the things he sort of asked about was governance. And I have mentioned a couple of times the UN Commission on Sustainable Development. And looking up the UN stuff, they've now changed the name of that group to High Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, which convenes under the Economic and Social Council. So you may hear that. It's kind of a crazy name as far as I can tell. And I wanted to just say one comment about the idea of testing, Greg, which you're raising and other people have raised. It isn't that, I mean, you can test the engineering aspects of it, of releasing sulfur and seeing how it disperses and stuff, but you really can't test the climate aspect without doing it. And so that's why you sort of really want to advocate, let's do it and learn as we go. Start small and learn as we go as the strategy and everything. And then you have to make your case for it. I've tried to make my case to Herb for this, and I haven't quite succeeded, by saying that, for example, we have to rely on models in part. Models have been tested and perform pretty well on volcanoes, which are a pretty good analog for it. Plus, we're going, in doing it with the models, we're going back to periods of climate where the models have proven they can actually represent what happens to the climate, as opposed to what's happening by people who say without it, like Ray Pierre Humbert, who seems to think it'll be perfectly safe to have let go up gradually till we get to 2.5 degrees. And then we can decide if we might need climate intervention, possibly. which I think one of our key differences from them is we're saying the problem's here now and at 1.5, and they seem to be confident, and he wrote it with Michael Mann, confident that you can go up, just keep gradually drifting up to 2.5 and it'll be wonderful or something. Meanwhile, you have the actuaries and whatever that other new report that just came out, Hollum or whatever his name is, who basically say, hey, it's going to even be worse, and we'll be up to 3 degrees by 2070 or something like that. So let me say what climate realism did. So the Council of Foreign Relations is a body in the United States. You have to be a U.S. citizen to be a member. The dues, you have to get nominated and approved of being in the field, and the annual dues are something like $5,500 a year. And for that, you get to participate in some of their things. So one of their fellows, a guy named Varun Sivaram, don't know, but a pretty dynamic guy. He's got actually quite a diverse background and is quite interesting. Is now director of the Climate Realism Initiative, is what they're calling it. And that realism initiative is, as he explained it, 5 sort of parts. That perilous levels of climate change are inevitable this century, so it's good he recognizes that. Adaptation is the best immediate policy option. Well, he's going to have real problems with that, it seems to me. Climate change poses far greater and more certain security issues than top-tier foreign policy issues like what's going on in the Middle East. That's quite an interesting statement from their organization or that project. The U.S. needs to budget for increasingly deadly effects. Okay, so that's for adoption. And then he sort of argued that there's still hope for U.S. leadership for averting the most catastrophic effects. And in talking about that, he basically was arguing that countries will act in their national interest. And that's the main reason for doing it. Forget caring about future generations or what happens to other countries or something like that. And that will eventually lead or might lead the U.S. to start doing something unilateral or mini-lateral on geoengineering. But that was sort of headed way down the future, so he's willing to let it sort of go forth. So they had an interesting discussion. He sort of presented what his views were, sort of all the nice science, but he had some panelists on there. One was David Victor, and another one was David Keith. So David Victor has spent his career looking at, he said he actually wants to claim endangered species status because he's an internationalist in the U.S. And stuff. But David Victor said it was sort of more hopeful than was Varun, saying that we've made progress. It used to be we were headed to 5 or 6 degrees, and now we're only headed to 2.5 to 3 degrees. So we're actually making progress coming down. It's still going to be awfully slow, and there are people who would disagree with what he's suggesting. He does suggest there's a lot of capital moving into doing things, which is encouraging, except the U.S. just cut off most of its capital or something like that. He did agree that some people were pushing that it's really only China that matters because they're the biggest in everything. He did basically make the case that emissions from all countries matter and the U.S. can't get off the hook that way. And so while he doesn't think we'll make the Paris Agreement limits, he thinks Paris has been an umbrella for a lot of different actions that have occurred. So that was sort of, interesting stuff. David Keith's comment was that a lot more is also going into renewables now. That's the new energy. And in fact, something that's been noticed on all the energy transitions in the past is from wood to coal and coal to oil or petroleum and stuff that's happened, that you do stop growth in that mode you're getting out of, but you don't push it back to zero. And that's what we have to do for climate change, is push fossil fuels from 80% of the energy back to zero. And that's going to be a real challenge. David was basically saying, look, you can actually do climate intervention. I mean, it's possible, and sort of went through saying that not all the criticisms are valid. And that's something I'm going to have to try and do as I talk with Nick Breeze. So it was interesting, but they were very much focused on countries doing it out of their self-interest rather than sort of building international coalitions like the UN was talking about. It's kind of interesting. The real question is, how do we really form a way to get there? What HPAC's been talking about is this Bellum Accord, get a few of the developing countries to put that forth as a start for discussion in Bellum about that something has to be done that is different. So, I think what we're all struggling is, can we find examples or modes or whatever that will work? Are there approaches that really make sense? And we'd be interested in everybody's thoughts on what can be done.
Thanks, Mike. You raised some big questions at the end. If there's no objection, those who might want to stay on for a few more minutes so that you can give your feedback to Mike and the rest of us. Those who have to jump off because it is the top of the hour, thanks so much for coming today. We tried to pack up this meeting maybe with too many items. Go through a lot of them very quickly, but I think it's been a useful and rich meeting. Any questions or comments directed at Mike or at me or anybody else before we wrap up today? Robert, yeah. Chris, you've been silent. Robert, Chris, you want to say anything, or is it too late to think straight?
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Right. So it is late here. It's just past midnight, but right. I'm managing to stay awake. No, I mean, interesting discussion, but you all know my views on these things generally, and I think that some of the points that Mike has just referred to just illustrate the challenges that arise from what effectively is an anarchic world order of nation states, each supposedly doing their own thing. But the reality is that global, it's in the name, and it's called global warming, guys, because it's global, and it needs a global collaboration to sort it out. So the idea that you're going to have all these individual nation states looking after their own interests is fanciful. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And as I put a note in the chat earlier with regard to this idea of nations doing their own thing, I think that it's very unlikely that will happen, because once you start talking about the solar radiation management in more or less any form, but particularly in the form of SAI, there is no way that you can constrain it within national boundaries. It's like the blue touch paper and stand back. So this is not the basis for any kind of coherent individual nation to go off and do its own thing. So I think that all of the points that are being talked about here just illustrate how difficult things are. And they bring me back constantly to the one observation that I had some years ago when I was going through my cancer episode, and climate change was just something I thought about in my more alert moments. And the question that I asked myself then, and this is what, 7 years ago, was, why should the next 30 years be any different from the last 30 years? Where is the evidence that things are changing in the world order? There's a different appreciation, there's a different understanding, there's a different dynamism. Well, if you can discern that, I would love to hear about it. But as far as I can see, it's just more of the same stuff. It manifests itself in slightly different forms different cast of characters. But Mike talks about the things that were going on at the UN. The UN is a busted flush. The Margaret Thatcher gave the very first speech by an international statesperson at the UN General Assembly in 1989 about climate change. And what's happened since? Diddly squat. And this is the problem, that these agencies, the UN has lost its way in a whole range of areas, and climate change is one of them. And they produce all these great reports, and they're full of wonderful statements, and it's all very, upbeat and positive. But actually turning it into coherent policy on the ground to make stuff happen isn't happening. And I see no evidence of it happening at any reasonable pace in the immediate future. And I find it very depressing. I'm sorry. So I'm sure you're glad you asked, Herb.
Well, I as you commented there, those of you who pay attention to what you say, which hopefully is most of us, will not be surprised by anything that just came out of your mouth. But as always, you've said it articulately and persuasively. So if you want to go to sleep, you're welcome to turn in for the night, or you can hang out while we can chat a bit more. But thanks, Robert. Clive?
Yeah. Okay. I don't have quite the same view as you, Robert. I mean, what goes through my mind is like this thing about so it makes sense that countries would act in their own interest. That makes far more sense than this idea of you've got to help people abroad. Just seems like piggybacking some other policy on top of, well, you've got to deal with climate change. So it's just saying what I'm trying to say here. When you look at how countries group together, or even small groups, become a country so that they can, fend off, an aggressor, and then groups of countries get together, like as in the case of NATO, to fend off an aggressor. One day soon, hopefully, climate change will be seen as a threat, like a potential warmonger aggressor, because that's essentially what it is, or like an alien invasion or something. And so countries, although they look after their own interests, grouping together to say, this is the war we should be fighting, instead of fighting each other, just there's some horrible thing that's gradually encroaching, and it keeps getting closer, and it's not going to go away. And as soon as we realize that, but the evidence is all around us, there's melting glaciers, there's hurricanes and all this sort of thing. This is what we need. This is the way we need to think. And yes, the fossil fuel industry want to deny it, but they don't rip, even ExxonMobil are now saying, no, climate change is real, but people still want fossil fuels. People need energy. The whole thing needs to be understood.
A key thing they need to think of and get across is that the global economy is just completely interwoven, and what happens everywhere affects everywhere. And so this tariff battle is sort of showing it, all the different things. And boy, there's lots more happening. Stories about the complications that arise because of how coupled the global economy is, and we're dependent on it. What's going to happen when, as I say, the U.S. doesn't get coffee? We can't grow coffee beans in the U.S. We got to care what happens in these other countries, and everybody has to do that.
Yeah. Thank you. That's
how
I see it.
It's unfortunate. I feel like things are just there. Things are going to get so frigging bad that people are going to see, things are getting so awful that shit is hitting the fan. That's the way I see what's going to happen. It's so frigging unfortunate that it takes that. But in a way, that's kind of where we can pin some of our hope that things are going to get bad and people are going to realize it because of how bad it's going to get, and that it's not going to be too late by the time that happens. This is, it's just unfortunate. Trump, it's a shit show. It's a complete shit show. And he's making it more and more obvious what a shit show it is. So, hopefully we can take some heart And it's like, darkest before the dawn, the cracks that let the light in, that whole thing is, hopefully there's going to be some mass realizations that come out of this where people realize, yes, we need to be fighting for something bigger than ourselves. That, nationalism is like glorifying selfishness. Just wanted to respond.
Thanks for your passion there. I'm sorry, somebody wanted to respond to Aria? Who was that?
I just say briefly that I think it's important to look at systemic dynamics and tipping points here. And you've got a number of it's interesting to watch how both some of the underlying forces that are developing. I mean, climate change is clearly one of them. Another one is the global asset bubble, the fact that the global financial system is really utterly bankrupt or on the verge of bankruptcy, right? And so there's many different factors taking place. It's very, as a dual Canadian Australian, it's very interesting to watch the impact of Trump on the elections in Australia and Canada, where you had the Conservatives, both in Australia and Canada, were guaranteed to win a few months ago. And all of a sudden, their campaigns are collapsing because of the revulsion against Trump, right? And people are really clearly, for the first time, for example, in Canada, you're seeing Canadians starting to identify what are clear values that distinguish them from the right-wing America, right? And the same in Australia. So I think that I think that you are seeing that these crises are going to help accelerate the evolution of constructive, sustainable views and values and organizations, and they're going to push new leaders to emerge and new organizations to emerge. And the challenge in this is to put forward ideas and strategies and to create organizations that help catalyze this process. And that's what I think is something that hopefully, I mean, the reason why I worked on our paper, but something that I think HPAC can do. And I think, right now, yeah, I agree with Ari. I agree that it looks pretty bloody grim out there. There's a tremendous amount of destruction that is taking place and will take place, environmental and social destruction, a lot of suffering that's going to take place in this process. But I'm not willing to give up yet, because I think that there are, the dominant trends are destructive trends, but at the same time there's an emergence of increasing awareness and most people on the planet remain good people. So I think there's a chance that we'll defeat the psychopaths and it'll actually succeed. But all right, what else is there? What can I say?
Thanks.
It's the only game in town.
I want to say something, give you my view in a minute or less. Then I want to ask Greg to comment, and then we'll have Robert Chris appropriately complete the circle of our meeting with his last words of wisdom. So my brief comment, and this comes from my own training and an actual implementation. I was head of planning for the state of New Jersey for a decade. And what I learned to do, not always successfully, is not to predict the future, which most of us are doing one degree or another, but to help us prepare for alternatives, so that in the case of whether it's us as individuals or HPAC or any other group, if X happens or X appears to be happening, we've thought about it in advance and we could respond. And that's the most effective way, in my experience, to deal with something like this. Because, predicting the future is a fool's errand. Almost no one predicted the downfall of the Soviet Union. Almost no one predicted the Arab Spring and what happened there. Almost no one predicted Brexit and the rise of Trump, et cetera, et cetera. These are gigantic planetary forces and changes that all the sophisticated people in the world, with very few exceptions, caught them by surprise. And I suspect that's what's going to happen with climate as well. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. And then I'll ask Greg to comment briefly and then Robert to wrap it up, unless Mike would like to say anything. But Greg, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you. So I just wanted to make a brief reply to Mike, who replied to me about the fact that as far as testing, you can't for SAI, because it's a global method, you can't really test it without doing it. The reason I'm in favor of initial tests, and the one I'm backing or pushing at my level is an Antarctic test of, loading the stratosphere with a certain amount of SO2 or aerosol and monitoring and instrumenting the atmosphere of Washington. The reason is that right now there is an attempt to ban any testing. That's the position of a lot of groups. What I want to see is facts on the ground. So even if the test I'm proposing will not cool the Earth, but it will test every other component, delivery systems, supply chain, everything. But even perhaps more importantly, politically, it will be, putting down a gauntlet, and it will be putting facts on the ground or in the stratosphere or whatever. And at that point, the community will have to, I can't guarantee this, but everybody places their bets. I think that the world community, all the stakeholders will now have to confront this as an actual thing. And that is the basis of my advocacy for an immediate test. If you want to do a first implementation of SAI, that's a much higher hurdle, I believe, to get over for a variety of reasons. And that means, to me, you're pushing it down the line, and you're also playing the strategy of those who are trying to maintain essentially a total ban on anything. So I want to violate the ban, and that's my methodology. That's my position. Anyway, just my answer. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Greg.
Okay.
Provocative and well spoken. And all right, let's wrap it up with Robert. Chris, the floor is yours.
I'm trying to get really brief. I think we need just to stand back for a minute. We all very quickly get drawn down into the weeds and the details of all of this. But actually, if you just stand back for a moment, the situation is pretty simple. Over the last several hundred years, we have created a geopolitical global economic structure that is unsustainable. We know it's unsustainable for all sorts of reasons. I don't need to go into detail about that. And the reality is, it's in the word. If it's unsustainable, it means it's going to collapse, because unsustainable systems, by definition, can't be sustained. So you either allow it to collapse, or it just collapses, or you have to change the system to make it sustainable. And that's where we're at. Now, the problem that we've got is that with the massive population growth of the last century, with 8 billion people on the planet, with this huge global economy, it is just there is just the most incredible amount of inertia in that system. Making any significant changes is really, really tough. So turning that system from being unsustainable to sustainable, and don't worry about exactly how it's done and the details, but just making that kind of shift is clearly going to be tough. And actually, Mike touched on one of the central points of this, and that is making the system sustainable does require us to remove most of the 80% of the fossil fuel energy on which the world economy currently depends. Perhaps not 100% of that 80%, but certainly most of it. And that is a completely unprecedented target to achieve. And, the idea of doing that quickly, it's just not plausible. And so when you crunch the numbers, the difficulty that we've got is making the system sustainable. How long is it going to take? And then we get into the interesting conversations, because of course, nobody knows how long it's going to take. We know we're already at 1.5 degrees. Probably we're probably, if you believe what Hansen is saying, we're probably at 1.5 degrees and are unlikely to go much below that now, and we're continuing the upward trend. As Mike has said, when you get to 2 degrees and 2.5 degrees, things get tough. I mean, many of us will remember, the famous red embers, but the burning embers diagrams that the IPCC got slated for. But they tell a pretty grim story about what happens as surface temperatures go up, and it is perfectly plausible on the current trajectory, even with some much more aggressive development of renewables, that we could be at 2.5, 3 degrees by not certainly earlier, before the end of the century. And in fact, it's not difficult to contemplate that we could be at 5 degrees by the end of the century. So these are ridiculous numbers, and what they tell you, again, don't worry about the detail. What they tell you is that there would be by then widespread societal and ecosystem collapse globally, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we return to sustainability. The system becomes sustainable because it collapses and then re-emerges in a new form. And the challenge that we have got is how to make that transition in an orderly fashion. And the problem that we have, in essence, and I'll leave it on this point, is that all of the actions that we could plausibly take simply take too long to take effect to stave off the likely collapse. Now, obviously, I don't know I can't state that as a fact. This all lies in the future. It's all speculative. It's all conjectural. But this is the mother of all juggernauts, and turning it round is going to be tough. And we should be under no illusions about that. And as I said earlier on, when you look at the evidence of the last several decades, you have to ask yourself, are we at a turning point? Where's the evidence that we're on the cusp of a big change and that suddenly all these things are going to be falling into place? And it isn't good enough that the awareness falls into place. It isn't good enough that people understand that there's an issue here, that there's a real threat, which they didn't appreciate before. The understanding is important, but it's only the precursor to the action. And the thing that really matters is the action. And until that happens, we will continue to go in the wrong direction. And I personally find it very, very hard to see any plausible path to action at the necessary scale that could happen soon enough to steer us off these rocks. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, for someone at 12:20 a.m. there, you're quite awake and articulate. Thank you, Robert. And thanks everybody. This is a really interesting conversation, both the post top of the hour and pre. Wanted to give a shout out to Sev. You came here a little bit, if I've noticed, a little bit after your colleague and recent visitor, Robert, basically did it a masterful, at least I thought it was a masterful summary of your projects and your ideas in 10 minutes. You may have a different opinion of what he said, but I was certainly very impressed both with Robert's articulation and your ideas. And for those of you who are not looking at the chat, Seb just commented with a question mark, orderly Armageddon. So that's one way to put it. So thank you, Seb, for coming. Thanks everybody else for coming. Good meeting, and we'll see you soon. And I'll just stop. Yeah, Robert, did you want to say something else? Hello? No. Okay.
So I was going to quickly, just again, say if anyone's willing to volunteer so that I can submit their name with our submission to the journal Climatic Change and suggest that they could be a potential reviewer. So if there are any senior scientists who are willing to offer their names, I'd be very grateful. Thanks.
Great. And a shout out to Doug, who surprised me by coming down to Washington 2 weeks ago and listening to me give a talk on the benefits of sunshine. We had a nice dinner, and I understand you may be coming down for our program at the end of the month. So welcome anyone else coming to DC. And It looks like people don't want to get off. I'm so impressed that.
Herb, can I just
Yeah,
ask?
sure, go ahead. As long as people are willing to stay on, I'm willing to stay on.
I have many responses to Robert Chris, but I won't go into those. But I was just going to ask if you could share a link to the AI notes that you've been taking, that Zoom's been taking. I don't know how you do that, but yeah, maybe. Anyway.
All right, I will attempt to do that. If I can figure it out, I will be happy to do that at some
Herb
point.
isn't the host, I'm the host.
Okay, so there, I'm
okay.
hook.
Yeah, so I don't know how you share those, but it'd be nice to get maybe.
What I do is I send immediately after the meeting a Dropbox link, which has got the transcript and the chat.
Okay, cool. That's cool. Thank you.
Now, I'm exploring whether it's possible to add AI notes as well, but
okay.
I haven't previously done that. And the people who what I've found is that when you go into these AI things, they're very deceptive and intrusive. And if they were honest in what they said about how they operate, then I wouldn't mind them so much. But it's just really, I've found it impossible to get the proper output from these AI summaries. But anyway, that's probably just my technical incompetence. But it's all a bit.
Okay, well, I guess I would just be interested in seeing what its take on what we said was, just to see an example of it. But anyway, it's
Fireflies from Brian and Read AI meeting notes from Hugo. So I've allowed them to make their own recordings. If Hugo,
I thought. Okay, I thought the AI the AI companion was actually in action.
Yeah, I've activated AI companion.
Okay, maybe that's something that the user, the individual users then actually invoke. I don't know. I have no idea. I thought it made a summary along with all the other products of the meeting. But in any case, I'll look into it myself. But thanks.
I've turned on AI companion, so when I get the recordings, hopefully there'll be an AI summary that's available as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to say I so wish I could come to DC and cheer you guys on. I'm so happy that you guys are both doing this, and just wish you the best of luck. I do think that it's probably important. I'm hoping you're including that there was a time that ERA would have worked, and that time is over. But it all started out in good faith. It just doesn't work anymore.
I thought you were referring to the Equal Rights Amendment.
Oh!
Then I realized you were referring to
that seems to be struggling as well.
I came up with. Yeah. By the way, I'm just playing as I'm listening. I'm just playing with the AI here, and I asked it a question. Are there any action items? And here's what it's saying. Based on the meeting transcript, here are the action items. Graham requested volunteers to be potential reviewers for his paper to the journal Climatic Change. Herb mentioned an upcoming panel discussion on nature-inspired climate intervention. There was a discussion about the need to push back against state bills aiming to outlaw geoengineering, though no specific actions were decided. Ari and McKenna suggested exploring the possibility of creating a political action committee to amplify HPAC's impact and ability to get funds. And lastly, there was a general call for continued efforts to promote and publicize important reports and papers related to climate intervention and planetary solvency. However, the meeting did not conclude with a formal list of action items assigned to specific individuals or groups. I thought that was pretty good. So anyway,
yeah,
there you go.
There you go.